The sky above Earth burned with the harsh light of alien vessels, massive ships descending like predators to feast on a dying planet. Humanity had failed to stop the Zorathian invasion. Entire cities crumbled under the might of their war machines, and the world's governments were reduced to shattered remnants. Yet, as humanity's civilization teetered on the brink of collapse, a glimmer of hope emerged. Aboard a hidden military installation in the Arctic, Commander Aurelia Kane stood before the ship that would become the last hope of humanity, the Crimson Blade. It was a warship like no other, a hybrid of human ingenuity and captured alien technology, designed in secret during the early days of the invasion. The ship was a masterpiece, but its true power had never been tested in battle. It was humanity's weapon of defiance, and it needed a leader. Aurelia's reputation as a brilliant tactician preceded her, but few knew the price she had paid to earn it. Her past was riddled with the ghosts of failed missions, the deaths of comrades she couldn't save, and a personal loss that had hardened her heart. As she gazed at the sleek silhouette of the Crimson Blade, she could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. The crew, assembled from every corner of Earth, was ready, but the reality of leading them into the heart of the Zorathian war machine was a burden she wasn't sure she was prepared for. "Captain Kane," a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Lieutenant Marcus Volkov, her second in command, his face set with determination, but with a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "The crew is assembled. We're ready to launch." Aurelia turned to him, her gaze hardening. "Good. Let's make sure they're ready for what's coming." She walked briskly toward the airlock, her boots echoing in the silent hallway. The crew was a mix of survivors, soldiers, and engineers, all brought together for this single, desperate mission. As Aurelia entered the command bridge of the Crimson Blade, she felt their eyes on her. They were counting on her. They were the last hope of the human race. The ship hummed to life, its engines glowing with a soft blue light, a pulse of power that resonated through the vessel's bones. The feeling of anticipation was almost suffocating. "Captain on the bridge," the communications officer, Ensign Lisanguian, called out. Aurelia took her seat at the command console, her mind already racing through the mission ahead. There was no room for failure, not this time. "Coordinates set," Marcus reported, his fingers flying across the controls. "We're targeting a Zorathian supply convoy on the outskirts of the system. If we take it out, we'll cripple their logistics for weeks." "Good," Aurelia said. "We hit them fast, hit them hard, and get out before they can retaliate. No heroics. This is just a hit and run." As the Crimson Blade powered up, Aurelia's thoughts shifted to the larger picture. The Zorathians were everywhere. They had laid waste to nearly every world they'd encountered. Earth was their next prize. But Aurelia wasn't going to let them win, not without a fight. The tension was palpable as the ship accelerated toward the Zorathian convoy. The crew worked in perfect unison, preparing for the battle that would define humanity's future. Aurelia's fingers gripped the armrest of her chair, every instinct on high alert. As the Crimson Blade broke through the atmosphere and into space, the stars stretched out before her like a battlefield, each one a potential grave. "Approaching target," Marcus said, his voice steady. "We're in range." The moment had arrived. Aurelia's voice cut through the silence. "Engage the enemy. Full firepower." The ship's weapon systems came to life, releasing a barrage of energy blasts that streaked across space like streaks of crimson fire. Explosions rocked the convoy, tearing through the Zorathian ships with terrifying precision. But the response was immediate. The Zorathian vessels retaliated with devastating fire, their weapons far superior to anything humanity had ever faced. As the Crimson Blade shook under the barrage, Aurelia's mind raced. This wasn't going to be as easy as they had hoped. The Zorathians were already reinforcing the convoy with more ships. They had underestimated the enemy. The battle was just beginning. The battle exploded into chaos as the Crimson Blade tore through the Zorathian convoy. Energy blasts from the ship's massive cannons struck with deadly accuracy, turning enemy ships into clouds of debris. But the Zorathian retaliation was swift and brutal. A swarm of smaller, agile ships darted in and out of the chaos, their plasma bolts searing through the darkness of space and striking the Crimson Blade with terrifying precision. The warship shuddered under the attack, and sparks flew from the control panels. "Shields are holding, but barely." Ensign Lisa Nguyen shouted from her station, her voice strained. "The smaller ships are flanking us. Redirect energy to port side shields," Aurelia ordered, her eyes fixed on the view screen. "We need to buy time until we can finish the convoy." Lieutenant Volkov's voice echoed through the comms. "We're losing fighters. They're too fast. We can't get a clear shot." Aurelia clenched her fists. This was far from the clean strike they had planned. The Zorathians were using their superior speed and maneuverability to outflank them, hitting the Crimson Blade where it was weakest. It wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a bloody lesson in how outmatched they truly were. "Deploy all fighter wings," Aurelia barked. "Give us some breathing room." As the fighter bays opened, a dozen sleek, human-made attack ships rocketed into space, engaging the enemy in a desperate dance of death. The Crimson Blade now had a small moment of reprieve, its cannons hammering down on the Zorathian ships in a barrage of energy. Yet despite the brief advantage, the Zorathians were quick to adapt, countering with devastating force. A loud explosion shook the ship, and alarms blared across the bridge. "Damage to aft sections," reported Ensign Markov, the engineering officer. "We've lost main propulsion on the rear thrusters. We can't maneuver properly." "We'll take the hit," Aurelia said, her voice grim. "Keep pushing forward. We finish this, or we die trying." As the Crimson Blade lurched and tilted, the crew worked frantically to maintain control. The Zorathian fleet was regrouping, but they were still heavily outnumbered. Aurelia's thoughts raced. The mission had turned into a disaster, but retreat was not an option. They had to strike fast and hard, or they'd be overrun and crushed. "All batteries, fire on my mark," Aurelia shouted. She watched as the Zorathian flagship, a massive armored warship, swung into view. It had the power to end this battle in an instant, but its broadside was vulnerable. This was the break they needed. "Mark," Aurelia commanded. The Crimson Blade's main cannons fired in unison, sending a torrent of energy toward the Zorathian flagship. The massive warship shook as the blasts hit, tearing through its outer defenses. The enemy flagship began to list, flames streaming from its hull as it struggled to maintain its course. But the Zorathians, desperate to protect their command ship, retaliated with an all-out assault. The Crimson Blade was caught in the middle, forced to endure wave after wave of plasma fire. The shields flickered under the strain, and the ship groaned in protest as it was pushed to its limits. "Shields down to 20%, Nguyen called out. "We can't take much more." "Focus fire on their engines," Aurelia ordered. "We cripple them. We finish this." The crew's determination was palpable. Every member, from the gunners to the engineers, moved with a sense of purpose, knowing that failure meant extinction. As the final salvo of energy bolts streaked toward the Zorathian flagship, the massive ship's engines erupted in a violent explosion. The flagship went dark, its hull twisting and cracking as it tumbled into the void. "Flagship is down," Volkov said, his voice breathless but triumphant. But the victory came at a cost. The Crimson Blade was heavily damaged, and many of its fighters had been destroyed. The crew's losses were mounting, and Aurelia knew they couldn't stay and celebrate their small victory. The remaining Zorathian ships began to regroup, preparing for another strike. "We've done enough for now," Aurelia said, her voice cold with resolve. "Set course for the nearest hidden base. We're not out of the woods yet." As the Crimson Blade limped away from the battlefield, Aurelia allowed herself a moment to process the carnage. They had succeeded in their mission, but the price had been steep. The Zorathians had felt the sting of humanity's resistance, but the true battle was only just beginning. The crew's blood had been spilled today, but Aurelia knew that if they were to win, more would be lost before the end. "Get us to safety," she muttered to herself, eyes on the distant stars. The fight for Earth had only just begun, and humanity's reckoning was far from over. The crimson blade limped through the vastness of space, its hull scared, and its systems failing one by one. Despite the victory against the Zorathian convoy, the ship's condition was worsening by the hour. Aurelia stood on the bridge, watching the stars streak by as they made their way to the hidden resistance base on the outskirts of human-controlled space. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional crackle of static from the comms and the low hum of failing machinery. "Captain, we're approaching the base," Ensign Nguyen reported, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "However, I'm receiving an incoming transmission. It's from a Zorathian rogue faction, the Vashera clan. They claim they can help us if we work together." Aurelia narrowed her eyes. The Vashera clan was notorious for its dissent within the Zorathian Empire, having openly opposed the Empire's aggressive expansion. Rumors had spread of their secretive rebellion, but no one had ever known how deep their resistance ran. The offer was both a glimmer of hope and a potential trap. Aurelia's gut told her to be cautious, but their options were few. Trust was a commodity in short supply. "Put it through," Aurelia said, her voice unwavering. The screen flickered, and a figure appeared, a Zorathian in dark armor, his face concealed by a helmet. His voice was cold, calculated, but there was an undercurrent of something darker. "Commander Kane," the figure spoke in a clipped tone. "I am Vrek, leader of the Vashera clan. We've been watching your progress. You've struck a blow against the Empire, but you're fighting a war you cannot win alone. We can offer you intelligence, technology, and reinforcements, but in return, we require your assistance." Aurelia leaned forward, her instincts telling her to be wary. "What's the catch?" she asked, her tone measured. "We know the Zorathian High Command has a secret weapon," Vrek continued, "a prototype that could annihilate entire fleets in seconds. We need you to infiltrate a Zorathian research station and acquire it for us. In return, we will give you the firepower to strike at the heart of the Empire." It was tempting. A weapon that could turn the tide of the war in their favor. It was the kind of chance they needed. But the stakes were high, and the risk of betrayal was always looming. Aurelia's fingers drummed against the console as she considered her options. The Vashera clan had made their offer, but she wasn't naive. Zorathians were ruthless, even among their own. This could be a trap to lure them into a deadly ambush. "I'll need time to think it over," Aurelia said, her voice firm. "I'll contact you in 12 hours. The transmission cut off abruptly, and the bridge fell into an uneasy silence. Volkov, who had been listening intently, turned to face her. "Do you trust them?" Aurelia didn't answer immediately. The weight of command pressed heavily on her shoulders. She had lost too many already. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, but this was a unique opportunity. She had no choice but to take it. "I don't trust them," Aurelia finally said, her voice a quiet growl. "But we need them." 12 hours later, the decision was made. The Crimson Blade would make the jump to the Zorathian research station and try to retrieve the prototype weapon. Aurelia had no illusions about the danger they were walking into, but the risk was worth the potential reward. The crew prepared for the mission, their spirits tense but resolute. As they approached the station, a sense of foreboding crept over Aurelia. Something wasn't right. The Vashera clan had provided coordinates, but no sooner had they arrived than the unmistakable shape of a Zorathian warship appeared on their sensors. "This doesn't feel like an extraction mission," Volkov muttered, his voice filled with unease. Aurelia's eyes narrowed as she watched the enemy vessel move into position. Her heart sank. The rogue faction had betrayed them. The Zorathians had known about their plan all along. "Shut down the comms," Aurelia ordered. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers. They've set us up." The Crimson Blade swerved to the left, narrowly dodging a volley of plasma fire from the enemy ship. Alarms blared across the bridge as the ship shook under the assault. The Vashera clan had played them, and now they were paying the price. "Captain, we've got incoming missiles," Nguyen shouted, her fingers flying across the controls in a desperate attempt to defend the ship. Aurelia's thoughts raced. They were outgunned and outnumbered, but they couldn't let this attack be the end. The crew was still alive, still fighting, but betrayal was a bitter pill to swallow. The Crimson Blade might have been humanity's last hope, but now it was clear. Survival meant more than just fighting the Zorathians. It meant fighting against those who would exploit their desperation. "Focus fire on their engines," Aurelia barked. "We're not going down without a fight." As the Crimson Blade retaliated with everything it had, Aurelia's mind was consumed with a single thought. This war had just become more complicated than she could have ever imagined. The Crimson Blade rocked violently as enemy plasma bolts slammed into its hull. The crew scrambled to keep the ship intact, their movements frantic but purposeful. Aurelia gritted her teeth, gripping the command chair as the battle raged around her. Her fingers tightened on the armrests as the ship's sensors lit up with incoming threats. They were caught in a deadly crossfire, surrounded by both Zorathian warships and the Betrayer faction. The Vashera clan. "Brace for impact," Volkov shouted over the comms. Another explosion rocked the ship, and the lights flickered as the Crimson Blade was sent spiraling. The warship groaned, its already damaged systems threatening to fail entirely. They were outgunned, their shields buckling under the constant barrage. Every second spent in this fight felt like an eternity, but Aurelia refused to allow fear to take root. "Redirect power to aft shields. We need to keep the rear secure," she barked. "Nguyen, I need that engine back online, now." Ensign Nguyen, her face drenched in sweat, nodded sharply as she worked feverishly to stabilize the power grid. "I'm on it, Captain. Just give me a minute." Aurelia's gaze flickered to the view screen, where the two Zorathian warships flanked the Crimson Blade. The rogue faction's betrayal had turned the tide of the battle into a nightmare, but Aurelia wasn't about to let them have the last word. She reached for her console, pulling up the ship's weapon systems. "Engage secondary thrusters," she ordered. "We're going to punch through their lines." Lieutenant Volkov's hands flew across his console, and the ship lurched forward. The Crimson Blade fired its thrusters, accelerating toward the closest Zorathian warship. The two enemy ships locked in on them, but Aurelia's mind was already 3 steps ahead. She had a plan. "Fire torpedoes," Aurelia shouted. A series of rapid-fire torpedoes launched from the Crimson Blade, their blinding streaks of light cutting through the space between them and the enemy ships. The first barrage hit home, tearing into one of the Zorathian vessels, rupturing its hull. The enemy ship detonated in a brilliant explosion, fragments scattering in all directions. But the second enemy ship remained undeterred. The Zorathians adjusted their fire, releasing a deadly wave of missiles that hammered into the Crimson Blade's forward shields. The warship's nose dipped as the shields flickered and failed. "Captain, we've lost forward shields," Nguyen cried. "We can't take another hit like that." Aurelia's mind raced. The ship was taking damage far too quickly. The Zorathians were relentless, and their numbers only seemed to grow. It wasn't just about getting out alive anymore. The Crimson Blade was humanity's last weapon, and if it fell now, Earth's future would be a dark and certain death. "Prepare the self-destruct sequence," Aurelia said quietly. Volkov shot her a questioning look, his face pale with shock. "Captain, we can't. We can't die here, Volkov." Aurelia snapped. "We finish the mission, or we take everything down with us. It's our only chance." The decision was harsh, but Aurelia knew it was the only way. If the Crimson Blade fell into enemy hands, it would be more than just the end of their mission. It would be the end of humanity's fight for survival. But just as she was about to give the final order, the comms flickered to life again. It was a Zorathian signal, this time from the Vashera clan's rogue fleet. "Captain Kane." Vrek's voice echoed through the bridge, colder now than before. It seems our interests have diverged. I regret to inform you that we no longer have a use for you or your crew. Your ship is a wreck. We've already launched our final strike." Aurelia's blood ran cold. "You promised us a weapon. You promised us the tools to win." "We never promised you victory." Vrek sneered. "You were always a means to an end. We've secured what we need. Your Crimson Blade is a liability now. It's time for you to fade into nothingness." Aurelia's grip tightened on the console as rage burned in her chest. The Vashera clan hadn't just betrayed them. They had used them. Humanity's last hope was about to be destroyed because of a lie. Aurelia was about to respond when the entire ship jolted again, sending crew members flying. Another explosion rang out, this one from within the ship. "Internal breach on Deck 12. Markov shouted. "They've infiltrated the hull. Seal off the sections," Aurelia barked. "Do not let them board this ship." The urgency in her voice was undeniable. But deep down, she knew the Crimson Blade was at its breaking point. The crew was fighting not only to survive, but to make sure the ship didn't fall into the wrong hands. "Engage emergency thrusters," Aurelia said, her voice steely with determination. "Get us to that research station. If we're going down, we take the prototype with us." As the Crimson Blade veered toward the Zorathian research station, the crew knew they were walking into a storm. The Vashera's betrayal had sealed their fate, but the captain's unyielding will kept them focused. The battle was far from over, and as Aurelia locked her gaze on the research station in the distance, she knew one thing for certain. Humanity would pay the price for trust, but they would not die without a fight. The Crimson Blade shook violently as it barreled toward the Zorathian research station, the ship's already battered systems pushed to their limits. Every jolt of the ship sent a wave of panic through the crew, but Aurelia remained steady at the helm, her steely gaze fixed on the looming research facility ahead. "Captain, we're on final approach," Lieutenant Volkov reported, his voice tight with stress. "Shields are down to 10%, and we're running on emergency power. We need to make this count." Aurelia nodded sharply. "We make it count, or we don't make it at all." The station loomed large, its spindly metal arms reaching out into the void like skeletal fingers, holding within it the prototype weapon the Vashera clan had promised. A weapon capable of turning the tide of the war. But now, as Aurelia looked upon it, she could only feel a grim sense of inevitability. Their survival depended on getting to it before the Zorathians, or the Vashera traders, could claim it for themselves. "All crew, prepare for boarding action," Aurelia ordered, her voice resolute. "We breach the station, secure the prototype, and disable their ability to retaliate." The bridge fell silent as the crew of the Crimson Blade readied themselves. Aurelia's heart pounded in her chest, but her resolve never wavered. This was humanity's last chance, and she would see it through to the end. "Engage docking sequence," Aurelia barked. The ship lurched again, and the docking clamps of the research station locked onto the Crimson Blade with a harsh clang. The vibrations were almost deafening, but Aurelia didn't flinch. The crew rushed to their positions, securing weapons and preparing for the chaos that awaited them inside the Zorathian station. Aurelia, Volkov, and a small strike team suited up in tactical gear, armed with everything from plasma rifles to explosive charges. They had no illusions about the risks. The station was heavily fortified, and the Zorathians would do everything they could to stop them. The airlock hissed open, and Aurelia's boots hit the cold, metallic floor of the research station with a solid thud. A sharp, sterile scent filled the air, a stark contrast to the acrid, heated environment of the Crimson Blade. The station's dim lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the walls as the team made their way deeper into the facility. "Stay sharp," Aurelia murmured, her voice a low growl. "We don't know what's waiting for us." They moved quickly, sticking to the shadows, their boots echoing down the sterile halls. It wasn't long before they encountered resistance. A squad of Zorathian soldiers, clad in heavy armor, rounded the corner, weapons raised and ready to fire. Before Aurelia could issue the command, Volkov and the others opened fire in unison. Plasma bolts lit up the hallway, turning the soldiers into smoldering husks. "Clear," Volkov called, his voice a mixture of adrenaline and grim satisfaction. The team pressed on, deeper into the heart of the station, the prototype weapon their only goal. But as they approached the central chamber, something felt wrong. The air felt thicker, charged with an oppressive tension that made Aurelia's skin crawl. "We're close," she muttered under her breath. And then, a voice, distorted and hollow, echoed over the comms. "Commander Kane." Aurelia froze. Her blood ran cold. It was Vrek, the leader of the Vashera clan. "You were so eager to trust us," Vrek's voice sneered, "but you should have known better. You were always expendable. The prototype is ours now. Your crew, your ship, all of it will burn." Aurelia's hand tightened around her weapon, fury boiling in her veins. The Vashera clan had played her from the start, and now they had orchestrated the ultimate trap. She had led her crew straight into the heart of it. "Take cover," Aurelia shouted, as a loud mechanical whirring filled the air, followed by a sudden explosion. The station shook violently, and alarms blared, signaling the breach. Another explosion, and a hole appeared in the ceiling, raining debris down onto the crew. Aurelia dove behind a support column, her heart racing. The walls of the station trembled as a massive Zorathian war machine, its armored hull bristling with weapons, descended into the chamber. The sheer size of it was overwhelming, its presence suffocating. "Ambush," Volkov hissed, his voice filled with disbelief. They were waiting for us. Aurelia's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking together. The Vashera had never intended to help humanity. Their offer of cooperation had been a ruse, designed to lure them into a trap where they would be destroyed, and the Zorathians would seize control of the prototype weapon. "Hold your fire," Aurelia ordered, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We need to get to the prototype before they destroy it." The Zorathian war machine fired a blast of plasma in their direction, and the team scattered, seeking cover as the station's structure groaned under the impact. Aurelia's pulse quickened, but she wasn't backing down. She had one goal, and she wouldn't let the Vashera, or anyone else, take it from her. "Stay focused," she barked. "We get in, we get the weapon, and we get out. Everything else can burn." The team moved with precision, navigating the chaotic battlefield within the station. They had no time to waste. If the Vashera clan got their hands on that prototype, humanity would lose its last chance at survival. Aurelia's eyes locked on the door to the prototype chamber ahead. It was the only thing that mattered now. The rest of the station, the war machines, the treachery, it all blurred into the background. She was going to win this battle, no matter the cost. The team moved quickly, each step measured as they approached the heavily secured door leading to the prototype chamber. The station's alarms continued to blare, signaling further breaches and damage from the ongoing battle. Yet Aurelia's focus remained singular. The prototype weapon was the key to ending this war, and she wouldn't let the Zorathians, or the Vashera traitors, take it from her. "All units, take your positions," Aurelia commanded as they reached the reinforced door. "We breach on my mark." She could hear the pounding of boots on the metal floors behind them, the Zorathian war machine growing closer with every passing moment. The sound of plasma fire continued to rattle through the station. But for the moment, they were in a brief lull, a split second where the next move could mean life or death. Her pulse quickened, but her resolve remained ironclad. "Ready, Captain," Volkov confirmed, his voice steady despite the overwhelming tension. Aurelia glanced around at the team. Their faces were grim, each one of them knowing that what came next would either change the course of the war or seal their fates. They were fighting for survival, for humanity's future, and Aurelia would not let this be their end. "Mark." The door exploded inward with a shower of sparks and debris as explosive charges sent it flying open. The team poured into the room, weapons drawn and ready. The chamber was massive, its metallic walls lined with advanced equipment, and at its center, a cylindrical chamber held the prototype weapon. A sleek, ominous device that hummed with an otherworldly energy. But they were not alone. In the center of the room, standing in front of the prototype, was Vrek. His dark armor gleamed, his helmet giving no indication of his expression, but the cold, calculating malice in his voice was unmistakable. "Captain Kane," Vrek said, his voice amplified by the comms. "I see you've made it this far, but this is where your story ends. The prototype is ours. You are nothing more than a pawn." Aurelia's heart pounded as she took in the sight of the weapon. It was more powerful than she could have ever imagined, radiating an energy that seemed to distort the very air around it. This was it, humanity's last chance. "We'll see about that," Aurelia retorted, stepping forward. Her team fanned out, surrounding the room. "I'm not leaving without that weapon." Vrek tilted his head slightly, a mocking gesture. "You think you can just waltz in and take it? The Zorethians are already on their way to finish what you started. You are already doomed." Before Aurelia could respond, the ground trembled as the Zorethian war machine, now fully deployed, tore through the walls. It had breached the outer perimeter of the station and was closing in fast. The sound of its massive footfalls echoed through the chamber, and Aurelia's blood ran cold. They were out of time. "Volkov," Aurelia shouted, "take the weapon. We need to move now." The team shifted into action. Volkov and two others sprinted toward the prototype, their weapons raised, scanning for any traps. Aurelia's mind raced. They had no time to waste. The Zorethians were already at the door. But just as Volkov reached out to secure the prototype, the room plunged into darkness. Emergency lights flickered on, casting the chamber in an eerie red glow. Aurelia's pulse quickened. Something was wrong. The Zorethian war machine had triggered the station's fail-safes. A loud clanging noise filled the room as metallic shutters began to close, sealing them in. The walls began to hum, a low, ominous vibration that grew louder with each passing second. The Zorethians had triggered the station's self-destruct sequence. The entire facility was going to explode in minutes. "Abort the extraction," Aurelia shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to get out now." Volkov, still inches from the prototype, hesitated. "We can't just leave it. We're this close, Captain. We need it." "No," Aurelia barked. "If we don't leave now, we'll all die here. We'll get another shot at the weapon, but only if we survive." The walls trembled violently as the Zorethian war machine's heavy footsteps grew louder. The team moved in unison, scrambling for the nearest exit as the countdown to destruction began. Aurelia could feel the heat rising as the station's core started to power up the self-destruct sequence. They were running out of time. "Go! Go! Go!" she shouted, pushing forward. The crew sprinted toward the nearest access tunnel, but the Zorethians were already closing in. The war machine's massive form blocked their escape route, forcing them to take a longer path toward the secondary escape pods. Aurelia's breath was ragged as she led the charge. Her mind was consumed by the knowledge that they were losing precious seconds. The prototype was within their reach, but the station was collapsing around them. And now, they had a new enemy to contend with. The Zorethian war machine loomed large in the hallway ahead. Its guns fired, but Aurelia's team dodged and returned fire, their weapons lighting up the darkness. But the war machine was nearly indestructible. Their shots bounced off its thick armor. "Move," Aurelia yelled again, pushing her team forward with desperate urgency. They ran faster, but as they neared the escape pods, another explosion shook the station. The countdown was almost at 0. "There's no time," Volkov muttered, his voice filled with frustration and urgency. "We're not going to make it." But Aurelia refused to let that be the final word. They were going to survive. They had to survive. The station's corridors were filled with smoke and the deafening roar of explosions as the self-destruct countdown echoed through every speaker. Aurelia led her team through the labyrinth of the facility, their path illuminated only by the flashing red emergency lights. The Zorathian war machine was in hot pursuit, its heavy footsteps shaking the very foundations of the station. Aurelia's pulse raced. There was no time left. The escape pods were only a few hundred meters ahead, but every step felt like an eternity. She could hear the war machine's growls reverberating through the walls, its relentless advance closing in on them. "Move faster," Aurelia barked, urgency and adrenaline coursing through her veins. They sprinted, their boots pounding against the cold metal floor, but the Zorathian machine was relentless. The air vibrated with its presence, the walls trembling as it neared. Aurelia could feel the heat building around them as the station's core ramped up its final countdown. The last, desperate moments before everything went up in flames. The escape pods loomed ahead, a small flickering hope in the chaos. The station's primary structure was collapsing, but there was still a chance, just a sliver of one. "Captain," Volkov shouted, his voice strained as he glanced over his shoulder. "We're almost there, but we need to slow them down. We can't outrun it forever." Aurelia's eyes darted to the walls around them. There was no place to hide, no room to maneuver. The war machine was too massive, too powerful. But there was one thing left she could do. "Cover me." Aurelia snapped, breaking away from the group and heading toward an exposed conduit. She sprinted to a nearby control panel, her fingers flying across the interface. She could feel the heat rising around her as the countdown reached its final seconds. The war machine's heavy footsteps came closer with every passing moment. "Captain, what are you doing?" Volkov called out, panic creeping into his voice. Aurelia didn't look up. She was already interfacing with the station's defense systems. She knew there was one final weapon they hadn't tried yet: the station's internal defense drones. They were a last resort measure, but in this moment, they were their only hope. With a final, urgent keystroke, the control panel hummed to life. A series of armed drones began to deploy, their sleek forms materializing from hidden bays along the station's walls. They were the last line of defense, and Aurelia hoped they would be enough. "I've activated the defense drones," Aurelia said, her voice tense. "They'll buy us a few seconds. Let's move." Volkov didn't hesitate. He barked orders to the rest of the team, and they continued their sprint toward the escape pods. The Zorathian war machine roared, but as it turned a corner, it was met by a hail of plasma fire from the drones. The machine staggered back, its massive form shaking as the drones pounded it with everything they had. "Go now," Aurelia shouted as she sprinted toward the escape pod. The war machine was distracted, but she knew it wouldn't be for long. The drones were holding it off, but they were no match for the machine's sheer power. The team reached the escape pods just as the station's final countdown reached its last few seconds. Aurelia reached for the pod's emergency release, her fingers shaking. With a sharp hiss, the pod's doors opened. "Everyone in," Aurelia barked. One by one, the crew filed into the pod, their faces grim as the sound of the Zorathian war machine grew louder. Volkov was the last to climb in, his face taut with fear and determination. "Captain, we need to go now," he yelled. But Aurelia hesitated, her eyes flickering to the control panel. She had one final job to do. She reached for a detonator hidden on her belt, pressing it with all her might. The Crimson Blade was still out there, fighting for survival. It was humanity's last ship, and she couldn't let it fall into the hands of the enemy. The Zorathians and Vashera had to be stopped, no matter what. With a press of a button, the Crimson Blade's self-destruct sequence was activated. She heard the countdown begin, and in that moment, she knew that this was their last, desperate gamble. The ship, the weapon, everything they had fought for would be gone. But the Zorathians would never claim it. "Let's go," Aurelia shouted, jumping into the pod just as the countdown hit 0. The escape pod shot away from the station, tumbling through space as the massive structure behind them erupted in a brilliant flash of light. The shockwave rocked the pod, sending them tumbling, but Aurelia held onto the control console, her heart racing. "Status report," she barked. Nguyen's voice came through, strained but alive. "We're clear of the station. Shields are holding. But the Crimson Blade. It's done," Aurelia said softly. "We gave it everything." Volkov's voice was filled with a strange reverence. "But we're still here. We're not done yet." Aurelia nodded, her breath steadying. The Crimson Blade was gone, but humanity still had a chance. They had survived. But the fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "We're not done," Aurelia said firmly, looking out the small viewport as the stars stretched before them. "We live to fight another day, and we will finish this war, no matter the cost." Aurelia sat at the helm of the escape pod, staring at the void ahead. The stars seemed distant, their calm light a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded just hours ago. The Crimson Blade was no more. The station was a wreck, and yet humanity had survived. The team was alive, and that was something. "We've lost the Crimson Blade, Captain," Volkov said softly, his voice low with the weight of the loss. "We gave everything for it." Aurelia's hands gripped the control panel, her fingers trembling slightly. The Crimson Blade had been more than just a ship. It had been a symbol, a lifeline. It had been the last desperate hope of a dying civilization. And now, in the cold, silent void, that hope was gone. "I know," Aurelia replied quietly, "but we still have a chance. We can't stop fighting. Not now." The rest of the team was silent, the reality of their situation settling over them. They had escaped, but their future was uncertain. The prototype weapon was still out there, and with the Vashera clan and Zorethians both hunting for it, humanity's chances of survival seemed slimmer by the day. The pod drifted silently through the blackness, its engines low and steady. In the distance, the faint outline of a nearby space station came into view. It was a small outpost, likely abandoned after the war had swept through the system. But it was a chance, a place to regroup. "Lieutenant," Aurelia called to Volkov, her voice firm again. "Get us to that station. We'll need to refuel and regroup. We can't do this on our own. We'll find allies, and we'll fight back." Volkov nodded without hesitation, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Aye, Captain." Adjusting course now. The team moved quickly to secure the pod and prepare for docking. As the small vessel slid toward the outpost's docking bay, Aurelia couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The fight was far from over. If anything, it had just entered a new, more dangerous phase. "We need a plan," Aurelia said, turning to the crew as they gathered around the table in the pod's cramped common area. "The Vashera and Zorethians are out there, and we've just made them our enemies for life. They'll be coming for us, coming for anyone who stands in their way." "We could contact the resistance," Nguyen suggested, her voice cautious but hopeful. "They may still have ships, or even resources. We could join forces with them." "The resistance?" Aurelia raised an eyebrow, considering the idea. The scattered remnants of humanity's last military holdouts might be their best shot, but it came with its own risks. They would need to be certain that the resistance had the strength and resources to fight, and that they were loyal. "I don't trust anyone who might have ties to the Vashera or Zorethians, but we need to make contact." A silence fell over the crew as they considered their options. Every choice seemed fraught with danger, but in this war, there were no easy decisions. "We could also start from scratch," Volkov suggested. "Get a base of operations, gather intel, build an army. We don't need to rely on anyone. The galaxy is still ours to take back." Aurelia nodded, the weight of the decision heavy on her shoulders. "We don't have the luxury of time. Every moment counts. If the Vashera and Zorethians get the prototype, it's over. The crew agreed, and they set their course toward the abandoned station. As they docked, the cold, mechanical clang of the pod's connection to the station sounded like the last heartbeat of their mission. For the first time in days, they had a moment of calm. Once inside, they quickly scoured the station for supplies. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get them back on their feet. Aurelia's eyes scanned the bare metal walls of the station, the sense of desolation creeping in. But as she turned to her team, she saw something in their eyes that gave her hope. Determination. All right, everyone. This is where we start over. We'll make a plan. We'll find a way to take back what's ours. And we'll take down the Vashara and Zorathians, no matter what it takes. The team rallied around her, their faces grim but resolute. There was no turning back now. They had survived the worst of it, and they would not let the war end with them defeated. Aurelia stepped forward, her gaze hardening. Humanity's fight isn't over. We may have lost the Crimson Blade, but the war is far from finished. We will rise again. The Vashera and Zorethians will learn that humanity fights until the very end. The crew nodded in unison. Their mission was clear. They would rebuild. They would reclaim their future. And they would deliver Earth's justice, no matter the cost.